They cut down every tree on my property, all 14 of them. I came home from work expecting the usual quiet evening, and instead found nothing but fresh stumps scattered across my land. No warning, no permission, no apology, just destruction. And the people responsible were actually proud of what they had done. What they didn't realize was that buried deep inside the legal paperwork for my property was a clause so powerful that within 60 days, I wouldn't just get even. I would make sure they lost the one thing they valued most. The lake view, forever. Didn't see that coming, did they? Before we get into the story, make sure you're subscribed because these HOA stories somehow keep getting more unbelievable every week. And while you're here, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. My name is Marcus, and for the last 11 years, I've been building the life I always wanted. I own a 5-acre ranch property in the Texas Hill Country, right along the shoreline of a beautiful lake. It's the kind of place most people spend their lives dreaming about. Every morning starts with birds singing and water gently moving against the shore. No crowded neighborhoods, no traffic noise, no people peering through your windows, just peace. And the trees mattered. Those 14 oak and cypress trees weren't decorations. I planted every single one of them myself over the course of more than a decade. They provided privacy, shade, and a sense of home. They marked birthdays, milestones, and years of hard work. They were living memories rooted in the ground. Then everything changed. About 2 years earlier, a developer purchased property directly behind mine and transformed it into a compact residential neighborhood. 30 nearly identical homes appeared where open land once stood. Every homeowner automatically became a member of the Lake View Pines HOA. They had regulations for everything. And apparently, one of those regulations involved my trees. According to them, the trees were interfering with what they called a community scenic view corridor. The first letter arrived in March. It was polite enough on the surface. The HOA claimed my trees violated a shared scenic easement and requested that I voluntarily trim or remove anything taller than 12 feet. I read the letter, set it on the kitchen counter, and finished my coffee. The trees were entirely on my property. My deed clearly established that fact. I didn't consider the letter a serious issue. That was mistake number one. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one wasn't nearly as friendly. Now there were references to legal action, violations, and escalating noncompliance penalties. I contacted a local attorney, who reviewed the language and told me the easement claim was vague at best and probably unenforceable. So I responded politely. I informed them that I would not be removing my trees. The third response didn't come in an envelope. It came with chainsaws. I was at work on a Tuesday afternoon when a neighbor called me in a panic. She said several men were on my property cutting trees down. I jumped into my truck and drove home as fast as I could. 45 minutes later, I pulled into my driveway and felt my stomach drop. 11 of my oldest trees were already gone. All that remained were stumps. Near the fence line, 3 more trees had already been partially cut and looked ready to fall. The HOA had hired a landscaping crew and claimed emergency authority under the scenic easement. While I was away, they simply entered my property and started removing whatever they wanted. I stood there staring at the damage. At first it felt like anger. Then something else took its place. Something colder. Something much more patient. Because as I looked at those stumps, I remembered a conversation with my grandfather from years earlier when I first bought the land. He had given me one piece of advice. Marcus, never rely on the summary. Read the entire deed. Every page, every clause, every word. And suddenly I remembered one specific provision hidden deep within the original documents. An obstruction easement reversal clause. It was an old provision dating back to before the 1970s, tucked away on page 9 of the original deed from when the ranch had been part of a much larger agricultural estate. Most people would have overlooked it. I almost had. The clause stated that if any neighboring development, association, or HOA altered the natural landscape of the original property without written permission from the owner would immediately gain the permanent right to plant, build, or construct barriers along the shared property boundary. Furthermore, Any scenic or view easement claimed by the neighboring property would become permanently void. In simple terms, the HOA had just destroyed its own rights. The moment they cut those trees without my consent, they eliminated the very easement they had been trying to enforce. And they handed me the legal authority to block their precious lake view forever. That evening I called my attorney and read the clause word for word. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally he spoke. "Marcus, don't do anything yet. Don't plan a single thing until I verify this." A few days later he called back. The clause was valid. Completely valid. Meanwhile, the HOA board was feeling very confident. In fact, they sent me a letter congratulating themselves on restoring the community's scenic view. They actually celebrated what they had done. The HOA announced that the community had finally been brought into compliance. Their board president, a man named Gerald, even posted in the neighborhood Facebook group that the issue with the trees had been successfully resolved. 47 people liked the post. Gerald had absolutely no idea what was headed his way. Not long afterward, the HOA retained its own attorney and sent me an official settlement proposal. The offer included a modest payment for the destroyed trees and a promise that they would stop pursuing any additional action against me if I agreed to sign a waiver releasing all future claims. My attorney reviewed the document, leaned back in his chair, and smiled. Then he told me not to sign a single page. By that point, we had already filed the easement reversal with the county recorder's office. The filing was complete. It was legally recorded. It was part of the public record. And most importantly, it was permanent. But that wasn't the only thing we had done. While Gerald and the HOA board were busy congratulating themselves, I had already hired a professional landscape architecture company. Using every inch of property line space allowed under my deed, we designed something that would change the neighborhood forever. A living wall, 14 feet high. The design included 16 mature Leland cypress trees planted closely together to create a dense natural barrier. Along the same boundary line, we installed a cedar privacy fence built to the maximum legal height permitted by county regulations. And we still weren't finished. With all required permits approved and fully documented, we added a raised garden terrace along several corner sections of property. A decorative trellis structure extended above it, creating an additional 4 feet of visual obstruction where it was legally allowed. Everything complied with county regulations. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Construction lasted 11 days. On the 12th day, my phone rang. The caller was Gerald. It was the first conversation we had ever had. His tone sounded calm on the surface, but underneath it I could hear something else beginning to emerge. Panic. "Marcus," he said, "I think we need to talk about what's happening along that property line." I answered calmly. I explained that I was simply exercising rights granted to me under the county-recorded easement reversal. I also informed him that my attorney maintained complete copies of every document, filing, permit, and approval connected to the project. Then I told him the part he wasn't prepared to hear. The line went completely quiet. "Gerald," I said, "the scenic easement your HOA relied on to justify cutting my trees no longer exists. It's permanently void." Silence. I continued, "And the structures and landscaping I'm installing now cannot be challenged by your HOA. Not by you, not by the next board, not by any future board decades from now. The county has already recorded everything. The matter is settled." For several seconds, he didn't say a word. Then the call ended. 3 days later, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. I found out because several residents from the community contacted me directly. 3 different homeowners reached out. They told me they disagreed with what the board had done and wanted me to know that many residents never supported the decision to remove my trees. According to them, Gerald tried to convince the board to authorize another legal challenge. It didn't go well. 2 board members resigned immediately during the discussion. The attorney representing the HOA soon sent a letter declining any further involvement in the matter. Even their own legal counsel wanted no part of it. The living wall was finished on a Thursday afternoon. That evening I walked to the edge of my property and stood there looking at the final result. 16 cypress trees stretched across the boundary line, tall and full despite being newly planted. Behind me was everything I had worked 11 years to build. my ranch, my privacy, my lake, my peace. In front of me stood a solid wall of green so dense that not a single rooftop in the subdivision could be seen through it. And from the opposite side, the result was even more dramatic. The famous Lakeview corridor that the HOA had sacrificed 14 trees to protect was gone, completely gone, permanently gone, legally gone. 30 families had purchased homes at premium prices because of the advertised Lakeview. Now not one of those homes could see the water. Not one. All because Gerald decided he wanted to send a message. The irony was that I ended up sending a much stronger one. Some people think power means doing whatever you want. What they forget is that actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences last forever. If you've made it this far, then you already know these HOA stories never end the way people expect. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.